Thanks very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to today's conference. I'm here as far as possible to give a view from the housing association sector, firstly on the drivers for renewables and energy efficiency and social housing, a bit on the potential, but also I think importantly to give the message that it's not just energy efficiency, there are significant challenges for the sector. Now, I appreciate this is the session just after lunch, so you might be feeling a bit sleepy, but if you don't mind, I would ask for a little bit of audience participation. So to try and give context to the potential for investment in energy and social housing, I wanted to say that SFHA annually run a survey of members to find out what are the big issues that you're facing day to day and how would you like us to best represent you and to lobby government. So is anyone willing to guess on what any of the three main issues are for our members currently? This is always the danger with audience participation, isn't it? Tim, I'll give it fuel. Yeah, that's one possibility. Any others? Okay, thank you. You'll be pleased to know that fuel poverty and energy efficiency is a significant issue for members, and that's good news that there is drive for investment, but the biggest issue by a long way for our members is the impact of welfare reform, the effect that's had on tenants' ability to live in their properties, to pay their rent, to live comfortably in their communities, and the knock-on effect that has on housing associations, their income and their ability to invest. The next biggest issue is about investment in new build. There are 180,000 people on waiting lists in Scotland looking for social housing, either through the housing association sector or through council housing. There's a huge pressure to invest at a time when private finance isn't available at the same rates and on the same long-term basis as it was previously. So yes, fuel poverty and energy are big issues, but they're just one amongst a list of competing priorities that our members face. The next couple of slides I think are self-explanatory. Fuel poverty is a huge issue and there's a lot of anger about it, and it's gone from being something that I think was an issue in the poorest private sector housing and for people in real poverty to something that affects many people. The latest Scottish Government figures show that 39% of households in Scotland are in fuel poverty now. And the other big issue that drives associations to invest in energy efficiency is climate change. I don't want to say too much about it, but I think people now acknowledge it's a real issue. It's got real impacts on the environment, on our future as a society, and also on the world economy. So it's key that we invest and address that. So to say a little bit more about fuel poverty, big issue for associations. There's been rising levels of fuel poverty over the last 5 years or so, and that's really been driven by energy prices going above inflation year on year. Now, while housing associations have a proud record of having the most energy efficient housing by sector in Scotland, we house people in great need who tend to be on low incomes, so they're susceptible, they're vulnerable to fuel poverty, and above inflation fuel price increases is a big issue. And really, the sector now finds itself in a position where they've made a lot of investment in what you might call the easy or the mainstream measures, things like cavity wall insulation, loft insulation, central heating, double glazing, that had a positive effect. It made homes more affordable and healthier, but the increases in fuel prices is beginning to undo those gains. Now there's a need to make investment in more difficult and more expensive and I suppose less mainstream measures. Now the second thing driving an interest or a need to invest in energy efficiency in Scotland's housing are concerns about climate change. I don't want to say a huge amount about that, but housing obviously has a significant role to play. It's responsible for 25% of carbon emissions in Scotland. And social housing, I think, is often seen as having the potential to be a leader and an exemplar. There's groupings of social housing. Landlords have a long-term interest in the property, and they also have expertise in project and capital management. So having talked a bit about the drivers to improve energy efficiency, and I want to talk a little bit about regulation and funding for social housing. Obviously, in response to fuel poverty and to concerns about climate change, there's been a lot of regulation in the area. There's a UK Climate Change Act, the Scottish Government's Climate Change Act. The Scottish Government, as you'll have heard in the previous session, has set renewables targets for both electricity and heat to be met by 2020. And most pertinent for my sector, energy efficiency standards for social housing, which just roll nicely off the tongue, have been set. The government will start collecting data from social landlords on that from this April, and the first standards have to be met by 2020. Now, the standards are based on RD-SAP system, and what they're looking for is for all social housing to meet a set target based on SAP. Unlike the SHQS, which many of you will be familiar with, it's not prescriptive about how a landlord meets the target. All that matters is that the target's met. And in developing the standard over a couple of years with SFHA, COSLA and practitioners, what was sought was to get a balance between making sure the standards were challenging enough that they'll actually really make a difference to the lives of tenants, while at the same time acknowledging that there's investment pressures and, ultimately funding will have to come from tenants' rents, if not elsewhere. These are the proposed ratings. As I say, the aim is for them to be challenging enough to make a difference to tenants' lives, but not impossible to meet or not to drive up rents. There's really only a couple of ratings, and they vary depending on the built type of the house, whether you're a flat or a detached or semi-detached, and also depending on the type of heating. Proposed benefits, according to Scottish Government research, average annual saving on fuel bills for tenants of £127 per year, and actually if fuel prices continue to rise as they're predicted to do, that will become a lot more significant in the years to come. And also significant carbon emissions, and I think if we're being honest, the initial driver for the standards was to help the Scottish Government to meet its climate change targets. So what's the view of the housing association sector on this? In general, every landlord I've spoken to or surveyed or met through a focus group has said they fully accept the need for a standard because fuel poverty and climate change are such major issues. There's also a mixture of views on the sector depending on the type of property that landlords have and where they're located. So if properties are off the gas network, or if they're hard to treat or traditional stone tenements, that's likely to be more of a challenge than either a new build property or a traditionally built brick with cavity property. And maybe the big issue, and I think Jim might say about this, more about this when he goes on to speak a little bit about minimum standards generally. Our members say, well, what about the other 75% of Scotland's housing? Social housing only makes up 25% of Scotland's homes. If you're going to be real about addressing fuel poverty and meeting climate change targets, you've got to have standards for all. A little bit about the available funding, and as you can see from the slide, and that's just the main funds that are available, there's a lot of funding available, or at least a lot of different tranches of funding. Energy company obligation was the main source of funding, was extremely positive for social landlords until the autumn statement a couple of years ago, where ECO was essentially slashed. And since then, associations have generally struggled to draw in that funding for their programmes. There's a complementary home energy efficiency programme funded by the Scottish Government, which helps deal with mixed tenure estates, but actually at the moment, only funds the private sector, so social landlords aren't eligible for it. And there are renewable incentives, the feed-in tariff and the renewable heat incentive, which has been a big bonus for associations actually with off-gas properties. And I know a couple of associations have said it's made a tremendous difference, allowing them to provide affordable warmth to tenants in off-gas properties, so it's been a real bonus. Thanks. Associations' experience of funding, I just wanted to say a little bit about this. We're currently doing a survey of members across Scotland to get feedback, and we hope to then lobby the Scottish Government on future iterations of HEAPs, and also to have an influence on ECO when the Scottish Government gets control of that, as was proposed by the Smith Commission. It's mixed, really, and to some extent you could say it's a postcode lottery. If you're a housing association or a council in an area of high multiple deprivation, high density, and you've got non-traditional, multi-storey or system-built 60s and 70s housing, then in a way you've hit the jackpot. The first landlord I worked for was Cube Housing Association. They had a lot of 60s multi-storey blocks that they thought they would never be able to invest in. They're now putting in combined heat and power systems and externally cladding all of these blocks. But for other landlords where they're very rural or where they've got mixed tenure tenements, it's proving much more challenging. And I think moving forward, we need to find a way to actually fund and improve these sorts of properties. So in conclusion, yes, fuel poverty and energy efficiency is a major issue for associations, and they're keen to invest, but it's one of a number of competing priorities. You would expect me to say this when I represent a social sector, but we need more funding if we're actually going to meet the climate change and fuel poverty targets, and that funding needs to be clear and consistent and long-term. It doesn't help planning when funds keep changing or you get one-year funding or competitions for funding. But we do have major potential to contribute and to lead in low carbon schemes. I'm aware I'm running out of time, but I feel that as a Morton fan, my presentation's probably been not so much glass half empty as glass smashed and lying in bits on the floor. So I wanted to finish with a few positive examples of what associations can achieve. There is real potential. This is a scheme by West Highland Housing Association. It's near Oban. 89 units heated by a biomass district heating plant, produces affordable warm homes for their tenants. This is just 10 minutes away up the road, really. It's Lister Housing Cooperative. It's in a World Heritage area, Georgian tenements, and they've put in underfloor heating and solar water panels and made a real difference to tenants there. And really, if you can do it there, I think you can do energy efficiency anywhere. And finally, Clydebank Housing Association, one of the first to do combined heat and power, heating the multi-stories there and also using the excess electricity to provide electric cars for their tenants. So the potential is there, we just need the right support and investment. Thank you.